The story you are about to hear may contain detailed descriptions of intense violence. It will certainly be worse than fiction. Hello, my name is Les, and this is the Worse Than Fiction podcast. Thank you for joining me as we take a look at a true tale of unimaginable horror. You may have noticed that there is some sort of underlying theme that I point out in each episode of this podcast. Not only is this a podcast about true crime, it's a podcast about some of the most unthinkable acts that people can commit. Any murder is obviously unthinkable, but my objective here is to detail the worst cases, hence the name of the podcast. With each episode, though, I want to focus on the how of each case, and maybe an underlying lesson that we can learn from it, if we can. We obviously know how murders are committed, but rather than why, I want to look at how the subjects in question ended up being who they are. How did this series of events happen? What are the factors that led up to the birth of a monster? In many cases, we will never know, but I think we can still learn something from taking a look at the case as a whole. Episode 1 was the story of a man whose paranoia got the better of him and eventually led to him killing 11 members of his own family. Would he have ever killed them had he been shown some love throughout his life? Maybe not. Story 2 was a worst-case scenario of why we shouldn't trust a stranger. Sure, we all meet many strangers in life, and we never become their victim, but we are the lucky ones. Finally, Episode 3 was a firm lesson on why we should keep our doors and windows locked, even while we're home. Perhaps a maniac will invite himself in and decide that a few dollars are more valuable than our lives. If I am to be honest, I'm not quite sure of the theme of today's story. I guess it would be about how the justice system is flawed, and in this particular instance, a murderer was set free from prison only to continue his evil ways. You've heard me say it before. Killers don't just stop killing. This case probably isn't well known by most of you, but you'll probably be asking yourself why you've never heard of it in the end. So without further ado, let's get into the topic of today's episode. I hope you enjoy, if that's the right word for it. You know, I often think about whether the death penalty is an appropriate punishment. I think it can be, under exactly the right circumstances. And I know this is a touchy subject. Still though, I'm on the fence about it. I'm the type of person who doesn't even kill bugs, so wouldn't it be hypocritical of me to support the death penalty? Insects, spiders, and other small creatures are just trying to make their way in the world like the rest of us. They seek food, shelter, and a way to reproduce. The difference between us and the other creatures of the world, though, is that people are capable of malice. Animals kill to survive. Humans sometimes kill for pure pleasure, as fucked up as that notion is. Who, in their right mind, gets enjoyment from watching the life fade from another human's eyes? It's without question that those who do should be separated from the rest of society by force to ensure that security is maintained. At what point, though, would it be reasonable to, in turn, kill that person? What is or should be the criteria to be met in order to decide the ultimate punishment for a human? This is the story of a failure of the justice system, just as much as it's about a sadistic serial killer. This is the story of Kenneth McDuff, aka the Broomstick Killer. My main source for this episode is the book The Bad Boy from Rosebud by Gary Laverne. If you want all of the juicy details of this story, get that book. I highly recommend it. I mean, I'm going into detail here, but that book is one of the most thoroughly researched books I've ever read, and he even provides his sources at the end of each chapter. March 21st, 1946. Kenneth Allen McDuff was born to John Allen and Addie McDuff in Paris, Texas. He was the youngest of the McDuff children, with a brother and 3 sisters being born before. John, or J.A. as he was nicknamed, did basic farm labor, and Addie ruled the home with an iron fist, controlling all aspects of domestic life in the McDuff home. It seems J.A.'s only role was to provide a paycheck. They would be described as a strange family and not necessarily the nicest people, but no one thought of them as bad people. Somewhere between 1952 and 1954, the family would relocate to Rosebud, Texas, a small town just south of Waco. Within a couple of years, Mother Addie would open a laundromat just across the street from their home on Linden Street. During this time, J.A. also learned masonry and concrete work and would eventually have his own concrete business, which is said to have done well. From the outside looking in, despite their quirks, the McDuff family seemed to be average. They worked hard and provided well for the kids, while also offering valuable businesses to the community. Addie would become known locally as a rough personality over the years, being known to carry guns, and had been suspected by neighbors of killing animals in the area. Allegedly, she had even threatened an electrical company over the amount of time it was taking to connect a line to her home. Years later, she would deny all of it in an interview with Texas Monthly magazine. I should mention, despite the allegations, neither Addie or J.A. had a criminal record throughout their lives. It could all just be rumors that get exaggerated every time the story is handed from person to person. We'll likely never know for sure, though. Kenneth's troubles began at an early age. His mother ran the only laundromat in town, and he was often there with her. At 8 or 9 years old, he was in the laundromat with Addie, and a customer named Essie Truby had also been there tending to her laundry. She went out to retrieve something from her car, and while gone, Kenneth would allegedly steal her purse. After searching for some time, she became angry and confronted Addie about the theft. Surprisingly, Addie made Kenneth give the purse back, which still contained money in a secret pocket. After Essie told the story to some friends at a local salon, she found that she had survived an encounter with pistol-packing Mama McDuff. Addie would almost always deny that any of her kids ever did anything wrong. It always had to be some kind of conspiracy to keep the increasingly successful family down in some way, at least in her view. Kenneth was never a particularly good student, with his IQ reported to be 92, which is considered to be on the low end of average. He was bigger than most of the other kids in his age range, and eventually he learned to take advantage of that fact. He displayed little regard for basic rules, getting into trouble regularly. Some of the people who went to school with Kenneth said that he had a habit of bursting into hysterical laughter at inappropriate times about things that weren't even funny, a sentiment that would be echoed by police many years later after his string of brutal crimes came to an end. We'll get to that soon enough, though. In the 6th grade, due to his behavior problems, Kenneth's teacher would request special ed teacher and speech therapist Ellen Roberts to work with Kenneth. After 3 days of attempting to break through to Kenneth, she gave up on him. He had a hostile demeanor toward her and didn't speak a single word the entire time. There wasn't much that she could do if he wasn't even willing to talk. His brother Lonnie, though, would also spend time with Ellen working on his significant speech issues. Addie was said to have been grateful for the attention she gave her boys, regardless of how successful it may or may not have been. Kenneth and Lonnie were very close, essentially best friends. In an incident in high school, a student had went to the office to report to the principal that a baseball glove that he saved for had been stolen. The principal, Mr. Mayo, was a World War II veteran and ruled over the school much like a drill sergeant rules over their recruits. He was a man of virtue and didn't take kindly to thieves. Stealing was not to be tolerated in his school. A short time after the report, Kenneth strolled into the school's office holding a baseball glove that appeared to be smeared with black shoe polish and bragged, "Look what I found in a ditch." It isn't clear what type of disciplinary action was taken against Kenneth that day, but it's said that his brother Lonnie wasn't happy and even confronted the principal on the matter. Lonnie always had Kenneth's back. The following is a quote from Mr. Mayo about Kenneth some years later. "Did not get along with the students, teachers, or anyone. He would lie, steal, and destroy the property of others. Was in some form of trouble every few days. He had trouble in the community for reckless driving and stealing. His family would seldom believe he did anything wrong and were always angry with school officials and local police for punishing him. His family is very unpopular in the community. This young man has been angry with the world ever since he was in the 4th or 5th grade. His mother was neurotic and unreasonable. His father, not neurotic, but often unreasonable. However, the father and mother did provide Kenneth with all the necessities. Kenneth had the ordinary comforts as much as the average boy in this community." As stated previously, Kenneth was much bigger than most of the other students, and in high school, he greatly enjoyed intimidating and bullying smaller kids. On at least one occasion, though, it just simply wouldn't work out for Kenneth. A small-statured freshman found himself the target of Kenneth's harassment. Martha Royal said, quote, "Tommy Sammons was one of the sweetest boys I ever knew." He was described as quiet and well-behaved, an obvious target for a bully. One day, Kenneth apparently was taunting Tommy while he was hanging out with friends, calling him a chicken shit. Kenneth and Tommy agreed to fight in a ravine close to the school after class, and what everyone thought would be Tommy taking a beating was the exact opposite. Tommy was athletic, fast, and strong, neither of which was Kenneth. He was lumbering and sluggish. Before he knew it, Tommy had Kenneth in a headlock and, quote, "whipped the snot out of him," as one of the kids watching put it. From that moment forward, Kenneth didn't try to bully anyone anymore. Not long after losing the fight in 1961, at around 15 years old, Kenneth would drop out of school and move out of his parents' home and in with his brother. His father, J.A., hired him to help with the concrete business, where he eventually saved up enough money to buy a motorcycle. It was also around this time that he would begin drinking regularly and begin raising hell around town. He moved back in with his parents a short time later, but continued employment with his father, even though he hated the work. In 1964, at age 18, his behavior escalated, and he would begin a string of robberies at local businesses with some other local boys. He stole things such as money, checks, bullets, tools, and even ice cream. The real kicker here for me is that some of the ammunition he had stolen was lifted from a local 7-Eleven convenience store. I didn't even know those kinds of stores could sell bullets, but being from southeast Kentucky, I guess I've seen my fair share of unexpected things being sold at unexpected places. It would be on April 17th that Kenneth would be arrested and charged for the burglaries. In January of the following year, he would be tried and convicted of 8 counts of burglary and theft and sentenced to 4 years for each count. The sentences were to run concurrently, which meant that at most, Kenneth would spend 4 years in prison. He was paroled less than a year later. About 6 months after being paroled, Kenneth met a young man named Roy Green, and the two became fast friends. Roy had been hanging out at the Bremen Street dances with a mutual friend, Richard Boyd. Roy was described as simple-minded, and he liked hanging out with people who he thought were exciting. To Roy, Kenneth's antics were certainly impressive, and he would run around with Kenneth and Lonnie every chance he could get, even getting a job pouring concrete alongside Kenneth. Kenneth would brag to Roy about how, quote, killing a woman is like killing a chicken. They both squawk. Of course, Roy never believed any of Kenneth's crazy stories, but as you know, if someone is the subject of this podcast, the truth must be, well, worse than fiction. August 6th, 1966. It was the day after Roy had went and spent the night hanging out with Kenneth and Richard Boyd. The night before, the three headed to Hearne, Texas, and tied a few on. Kenneth would say something that would eventually come to haunt Roy forever that night. Quote, I know where people park and we can kill them, Kenneth said. After the two got up the next morning, they headed to a work site to do a concrete job, and when finished, they decided to go out to Fort Worth later that night. They got some beer along the way to drink during the trip, and once in Fort Worth, the duo would get some more beer and hang out with a friend they ran into at a local bar in the Everman area. Kenneth had an objective in mind, and it was to find some girls to hang out with. Later on, Kenneth and Roy would ride around and eventually found themselves around the Everman High School baseball field. McDuff spotted a vehicle nearby and thought there must be some teenagers hanging out, so he made his move. He parked his car a good distance away and pulled a .38 caliber Colt revolver from the console. He then instructed Roy to get the broken broomstick, which had been in his car for several weeks. The two then began sneaking toward the 55 Ford. About halfway there, Kenneth told Roy to wait, that he would handle the situation. When Kenneth finally made it to the parked vehicle, there were three teens having a casual conversation. Kenneth had expected it to be a young couple parked and making out. Robert Brand and Marcus Dunham, cousins, were there with a girl they knew, Edna Sullivan, who everyone called Louise. It was supposed to be a double date, but the other girl, Rhonda, got a bad feeling and backed out of the plan. Rhonda made a decision that would save her life that night. The other three weren't so fortunate. As Kenneth crept up on the vehicle, Roy headed toward them and heard Kenneth order the teens out. After taking Robert and Marcus's wallets, he made the three get into the trunk of the Ford, then took Roy back to get his Dodge Coronet. He then told Roy to follow him, and as Roy always did, he obeyed Kenneth. Kenneth then led the way south into the surrounding country, into farmland, where they would pull off the highway and onto a farm access road. A ways down the road, Kenneth pulled the car out into an open field and parked. He got out, opened the trunk and pulled Louise out and told Roy to put her in the trunk of the Dodge, and so he did. Kenneth then informed Roy of his plan to kill the boys because he thought they could identify him. Roy didn't believe that Kenneth was actually going to follow through. Roy was very wrong. Kenneth turned to the boys and pointed the revolver at them. According to Roy, they begged and pleaded for their lives, promising they wouldn't tell anyone. He began firing into the trunk of the car, aiming at Robert first. One bullet hit one of his ears, and the other struck him in the forehead. He took aim at Marcus and fired 3 bullets, while Marcus attempted to block them with his hands in a futile attempt. Kenneth didn't like resistance, so he went up to Marcus and grabbed him by his hair, put the gun up to his head, and fired the last shot, killing him instantly. Roy couldn't believe his eyes. Kenneth actually did it. Roy asked, quote, "Good God, Kenneth, what did you do that for?" To which Kenneth replied simply, quote, "I had to." The two then got back into the Dodge, and with Louise still in the trunk, they took off, continuing south. Again, Kenneth pulled the car off onto a gravel road that led through a hayfield. He parked the car, then got Louise out of the trunk and ordered her into the back seat of the car. Roy got out and went to the back of the car as Kenneth got into the back seat with Louise. Kenneth made her take her clothes off, then he raped her. When he finished, he made Roy get in the car with them and asked if he wanted, quote, "a turn" with Louise. Roy said no, and when Kenneth asked why, he remembered the .38 Colt Kenneth had. He grudgingly climbed into the back seat with Louise, and after some trouble getting an erection, he was eventually able to rape her as well. Kenneth then got back into the rear seat and raped her again. This time, however, he would also use the jagged end of the broomstick to penetrate her. This poor young girl endured an agonizing assault, according to Roy. Kenneth got into the driver's seat and headed out to yet another isolated road in the countryside. He made Louise get out of the car and sit on the ground. He got the broomstick out of the car, pushed her over, then straddled her chest. Kenneth was a fairly large man, standing at 6'3" and weighing around 230 pounds. 5'2" Louise stood no chance of fighting him off. He brought the broomstick down on her throat and pressed into her with enough force to break bones. Roy said, quote, "It sounded like air escaping out of a balloon or air hose." Once she was dead, the two threw her over a fence into some tall grass to hide the body. Kenneth wasn't satisfied yet, though, so he crossed the fence and strangled her some more, for good measure. He then ripped a necklace she was wearing off her neck, then dragged her body into a patch of tree growth and hid her among the brush. Kenneth and Roy got into the car and left the scene. What was meant to be a fun night out for a small group of teenagers turned into a nightmare for them and their families. Thankfully, Roy Dale Green had a conscience, unlike Kenneth McDuff, and the families of these poor kids wouldn't have to wait long to find out what happened. 2 days later, Roy and Richard Boyd went to pick up Boyd's girlfriend Shirley to cruise around for a while. Some time into the casual drive, Roy began sobbing out of nowhere. On the radio was a news alert about Robert and Marcus's bodies being discovered. Roy then told the story of exactly what happened to Richard and Shirley. Soon enough, he was telling the same story to the authorities. Roy underwent an ordeal that would see him branded as a villain, and as I see it, Roy was simply another victim, manipulated by an actual villain to do something this young man would never think of otherwise. Eventually, though Roy's intellect was limited, he was able to lead investigators to the general area where Louise's body lay. They searched the area to no avail and loaded him up and took him back to jail. Homer Barnes, the chief of police from the town of Burleson, and a few other officers stayed behind to continue searching. They did eventually discover Louise's body among the brush. Soon after, Kenneth McDuff would be located and arrested. Roy spent 5 hours on the witness stand testifying against Kenneth during the trial. McDuff's defense strategy was to paint Roy Green as the sole killer, and that he was simply trying to avoid the death penalty by pointing the finger at Kenneth. That strategy didn't work. Roy's testimony was believable, and his demeanor on the stand was far more compelling than Kenneth's. Ultimately, McDuff would be convicted and sentenced to death for the horrific murders he committed against his young victims. He never once admitted guilt, even after his sentence. I won't go into Kenneth's years in prison. They were eventful, but once again I recommend Gary Laverne's book, The Bad Boy from Rosebud. It details everything. Kenneth, who had dropped out of high school, earned a GED, and gained 35 years of college credit during his time behind bars. Roy pled guilty to his role in the crimes and was sentenced to 5 years for the murder of Marcus Dunham and 25 years for the murder of Edna Louise Sullivan. Roy would serve 10 years in prison until the inner torment of the crimes took a major toll on his mental health. He was unable to sleep and reported hearing voices and hallucinating, and would eventually be sent to Rusk State Hospital for treatment. 3 years later, Roy was granted parole and was set free in 1979. I'm not sure where I stand on Roy spending time in prison. He admittedly raped Louise and followed Kenneth's instructions, but he was impressionable and easily controlled. He knew the crimes were wrong, and he came forward quickly. He was undoubtedly traumatized by the crimes, while Kenneth was unfazed and defiant in the face of the law. In 1972, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that the death penalty was unconstitutional. Murderers among the ranks of Kenneth McDuff would have their death penalty sentences commuted to life in prison. Crackdown laws began going into effect in Texas soon after, which saw the prison population spike to unprecedented levels. Systematically, the justice system began paroling low-level inmates to make way for new offenders. Eventually, the parole board began granting freedom to criminals in the upper echelons of crime. Murderers were being set free at an alarming pace, and among those, Kenneth McDuff, who once sat on death row for a triple murder, would be released on parole in 1989. This was one of the biggest mistakes the Texas justice system would ever make, and in just a few short years, this mistake would spark a sweeping change in Texas. After being set free, much to the dismay of the population of Rosebud and the surrounding area, Kenneth appeared to be eager to set his life straight. He enrolled in classes at Texas State Technical Institute and moved into a dorm on campus. This was, of course, after a parole violation for terroristic threatening saw him back in prison for a short time. His major was CNC machine operation, and despite poor attendance, he graduated with a surprisingly good 3.3 GPA. Since being released from prison, Kenneth was known to have been an avid crack smoker and enjoyed the company of sex workers frequently. They would describe sex with Kenneth as rough and painful, never pleasurable. McDuff was a sexual sadist. He didn't get his pleasure from the sex. He got it from inflicting pain and controlling women. Merely days after he walked out of prison, a body was found in a grassy field in Temple, Texas, not far from Kenneth's parole officer station. She was severely beaten and strangled to death, and would be identified as Seraphia Parker, a local sex worker. There is no evidence that Kenneth committed the murder, and he was never charged with the crime. Quote, informed confidential sources believe that this murder was the first McDuff committed once released from prison. Eventually, he obtained a job at a quick-pack convenience store near TSTI, where he would learn the inner workings of the store, how the money was handled, scheduling, etc. The man who trained him, Aaron Northrup, had introduced him to his wife Melissa, who was also employed with QuickPack. He worked at that location for a few weeks and would be transferred to a different store in the outskirts of Waco, where he worked mostly overnight shifts. Not long after, he walked away from the job, but always in his mind was the idea to rob the place. The biggest flaw in security, as he saw it, was Melissa Northrup, who was small and would be easy for 6'3", 230-pound McDuff to subdue. Brenda Thompson was a 37-year-old woman who lived in the same area as Kenneth, known as The Cut, an impoverished area known for drugs and prostitution. She was indeed a sex worker who worked the streets in the area, and the years of drug use had taken a toll on her body. She looked much older and worn than her age would suggest. On October 10th, 1991, she would get into a red pickup driven by none other than Kenneth McDuff, which would prove fatal. Shortly after picking her up, McDuff would encounter a police DUI checkpoint. As an officer approached McDuff's vehicle, Brenda started screaming and kicking at the windshield. The officer believed that her hands were tied behind her back since he never saw them. McDuff floored the gas pedal, driving straight at the officers, who were able to get out of the way just in time. They loaded up into their cruisers and chased after McDuff, who was eventually able to lose them. Kenneth then drove to a wooded area miles away from the roadblock, and Brenda Thompson was never seen again. 6 days later, on October 15th, witnesses reported seeing Regina Moore, a 21-year-old sex worker who also worked The Cut, in McDuff's truck. She was a mother of 3 at her young age, but her kids had been adopted by a family member by this point. She, too, bore the sunken eyes and unhealthy frame of a drug addict, and she would often steal money from wallets of John's to pay for drugs. An anonymous sex worker reported that McDuff had came looking for Gina, saying, quote, when I find her, I'm gonna kill that bitch. She ripped me off and I'm gonna kill her. Stealing from Kenneth McDuff is not a very good idea. She had been arrested on the evening of October 9th at the very same DUI checkpoint that Kenneth had drove through and was released on bond around the time it happened. On the 15th, McDuff and Gina were spotted near a fast food restaurant, and eventually McDuff would drive along Highway 6 just outside Waco to a bridge where he pulled the truck off the road. As in the case of Brenda, Gina was never seen alive again. Her skeleton wouldn't be found until 1998 after McDuff told his cellmate turned informant where she was. The only person who knows what Kenneth did to her that night was himself. It's very likely that he sexually tortured, beat, and strangled her, much like some of his other victims. In truth, the details of most of McDuff's murders aren't known. What is known is that girlfriends and sex workers that McDuff had been with told very similar stories of his sadistic behavior, and these are the people who survived their encounter with this monster. What he did to most of his murder victims will forever remain a mystery. He never once admitted guilt for any of his crimes, and his mother Addie maintained that all of the evidence against him was part of some conspiracy to the bitter end. Colleen Reed, a 28-year-old Louisiana native that had served in the Army Reserves, was an attractive, successful woman. She held a degree in accounting from LSU and was making her way in the world. Colleen spent Christmas of 1991 with her sister Lori and her 2 nephews. This would be the last time Lori would see Colleen alive. In the evening of December 29th, after waking from a nap, Colleen headed out to deposit a check and wash her brand new 1991 Mazda Miata. Just before Colleen left her home, Kenneth McDuff went to his friend Hank Worley's house, and the two would take some beer and drive to Austin to find some speed. During the drive, McDuff talked about shooting the tires of cars driven by women and kidnapping someone. Hank thought it was just crazy talk and that McDuff didn't really mean it. He was very wrong. At 8:45 p.m. that evening, a security camera snapped 2 pictures of Colleen at an ATM. Then she went to a nearby Whole Foods to purchase a couple of things. She left and went to a car wash on West 5th Street to clean her prized car. Shortly thereafter, a tan 1985 Ford Thunderbird pulled into one of the car wash stalls next to Colleen. Out of the car stepped Kenneth McDuff. Hank Worley was busy throwing away beer bottles when Kenneth returned to the car with a screaming woman in his arms, one hand around her throat. He ordered Hank into the car and forced Colleen into the back seat. He told Hank to get in the back seat with her to hold on to her, and he did exactly that. A witness nearby heard her screams and went to the car wash to find her still soapy vehicle sitting abandoned. He went back to his friend's apartment and told her to dial 911. After escaping the scene the wrong way on a one-way street, McDuff got on the Mopac Freeway driving south. He exited the freeway near Capitol of Texas Highway and ordered Hank to drive. McDuff got into the back seat with Colleen, made her take her clothes off, and began raping her, both vaginally and anally. At some point, Hank made a U-turn and re-entered the Mopac Freeway, traveling north at least 20 miles, then pulling off onto Ranch Road 620. McDuff forced Colleen to perform oral sex on him, and as he was pushing her head down, she scratched him near his eyes. He punched her several times and pulled a shoelace from a pair of shoes and tied her hands behind her back. Once subdued, it only got worse for Colleen, and more exciting for McDuff. He lit a cigarette and began burning her with it, on her vagina. Worley testified that McDuff was having the time of his life as the torture continued. At some point, they stopped the car and McDuff would take the wheel as Hank got into the back seat to rape her himself. He claimed that it was to protect her from Kenneth, which is obviously bullshit. He testified that he tried to untie her but was unable to and didn't want to anger McDuff by cutting the strings. McDuff drove north, eventually reaching a secluded area near J.A. and Addie's home, where he would park the car and drag Colleen out and onto the hood of the vehicle. He raped her again and made her perform oral sex on him. Investigators believe that she must have bitten his penis, as Hank testified, McDuff screaming, quote, "I'll kill you, bitch." According to Hank, he drew a fist back and punched her so hard, quote, "it sounded like a big tree breaking." She fell over and her head slammed on the ground. McDuff got another cigarette, lit it, and started burning her again. She didn't react or move any longer. McDuff put her in the trunk of the car, and the two headed back to Hank's mobile home in the Cut, where McDuff asked to borrow a shovel, but Hank didn't have one. McDuff left and Hank went to bed. Colleen's body wouldn't be found for 7 years. All of the details of that night come directly from the testimony of Hank himself, who isn't the most honest person in the world. But if only some of it is true, it's still a horrific series of events. Both Unsolved Mysteries and America's Most Wanted aired segments about Colleen's abduction. Around February 24th, 1992, Keith, a student of TSTI, heard a knock on his dorm window. Standing outside was Valencia K. Joshua, a young black woman who Keith didn't know. She told him she had the wrong dorm and went to the next window to dorm 118, Kenneth McDuff's dorm. Keith heard her ask, "Are you ready?" Valencia's sister reported that she was a sex worker, and she didn't even know Valencia was in the Waco area at the time. Kenneth McDuff was no friend to African Americans. He was a steadfast racist. Valencia's body was discovered months later near the TSTI campus. February 28, 1992. Keith had new tires installed and other work done to his car using a credit card given to him by Addie to pay for the services. He then went to a cycle shop where the owner agreed to give him $100 cash for a $110 credit charge. McDuff then went to the Quick Pack where he had worked before to get gas. He had talked several times about robbing the store while Melissa Northrup worked alone overnight, but her shift didn't begin until 11 p.m. that evening. Later on, McDuff met up with some friends, smoked crack and drank beer, and schemed of a way to convert some of his credit allowance into cash. He went to a local 7-Eleven and bought 8 cartons of cigarettes with the intention of selling them. After the credit approval, he signed the credit slip and wrote his license plate number next to it. Sometime after starting her shift at the Quick Pack on February 29th, 2 sheriff's deputies stopped by the store and talked with Melissa for a short time. A few hours later, Kenneth had been driving along New Road, where he would begin experiencing car troubles. The cigarettes he was trying to sell had been stolen from him. He didn't have any more crack to smoke, and he had been unsuccessful at finding a woman to have sex with. His car broke down within view of Quick Pack, and it was late. No one was around, except for pregnant mother of 2, Melissa Northrup. Sometimes Aaron, Melissa's husband, would come to the store and stay with her during her shift, but on this night, he stopped by only briefly around 1 a.m. Melissa and Aaron called each other a few times through the night, but during a call at 4 a.m., he told her he needed to get some sleep so he could care for their kids. Minutes later, he called her back, but didn't get an answer. A witness later reported seeing McDuff pushing his Thunderbird with another car, believed to be Melissa's. The witness stopped and asked McDuff if he needed help, but he refused. After the witness left, McDuff drove off in Melissa's car. After several attempts at calling Melissa, Aaron decided to drive to Quick Pack to check on her, and when he got there, a customer inside was waiting for service. Melissa was nowhere to be found. He checked the cash register and saw that all the money had been taken from the drawer and Melissa's purse was still under the counter. He went out and noticed that her car was gone, then ran back in and called 911. Jerry Myers, a student at TSTI, reported seeing McDuff driving Melissa's car with her in it, north on Interstate 35 with Melissa in the passenger seat. McDuff drove about 100 miles to southeast Dallas County near Combine, Texas, a small town. At some point, he got the car stuck in mud, and he took Melissa and headed out on foot and went to a remote area near a gravel pit that had filled with water. The details of what he did to her aren't fully known, but her feet were tied together and her hands were bound behind her back with her own shoelaces. She almost certainly endured brutal sexual torture for some time and was most likely strangled to death. On March 3rd, Addie called the local sheriff's office and reported Kenneth missing, having not seen or heard from him since February 29th. On March 6th, the manager of the New Road Inn reported McDuff's vehicle to police for obstructing customer parking. They summoned a tow truck, and the car was impounded. Soon after, detectives were putting the pieces together. Both Kenneth and Melissa were reported missing, and his car was abandoned just a stone's throw away from Quick Pack. Nearly a week later, Officer Aletha Justice discovered Melissa's car stuck in the mud on James Road. The son of the property owner stated that he first noticed the vehicle on March 1st when he intended to grade the road. When Officer Justice reported the vehicle, dispatch informed her that the vehicle had been reported stolen and involved in a robbery and possible kidnapping. The seat was pushed all the way back, but Melissa stood only 4 feet 11 inches tall. Her body would finally be found near Combine, Texas, 51 days after she was abducted by Jeffrey Hurd, who had taken his boat into a flooded gravel pit to go fishing. On March 9th, a week after Kenneth failed to report to his parole officer, an emergency arrest warrant was issued and the hunt began. Investigators believed that Addie knew all along where Kenneth was and that he was coaching her on what to tell them. He had to be hiding somewhere, and somebody had to know exactly where he was. On April 10th, McDuff was arrested in Kansas City, Missouri during a prostitution sting operation conducted by the Kansas City Police Department. Since the charge was a minor misdemeanor, they didn't run a background check on Kenneth. He had been in Kansas City for about a month at this time, where he eventually got a job as a garbage collector. He rented a small apartment with a man named Francis, who he had befriended just a few days prior. The landlord reported no trouble from Kenneth, and neighbors made no complaints. He was quiet and kept to himself. He had stolen a Social Security card from a pool hall in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and had assumed the identity of its owner, Richard Fowler. According to his roommate Francis, as was the case with Roy and Hank, McDuff often talked about robbing and killing people, and McDuff slept with a butcher knife. Meanwhile, officials from the ATF, U.S. Marshals, and local law enforcement were on high alert and searching relentlessly for McDuff. U.S. Marshals Mike and Parnell McNamara, brothers, interviewed Alva Hank Worley, who denied even knowing who McDuff was. After being pressed, he told them that he had only met him once and that he had never worked on McDuff's Thunderbird. He was lying, of course. They laid out the crimes they believed McDuff committed, but Hank never wavered and stuck to his story for a while. They hounded him relentlessly for weeks until he eventually broke and told them the story of the abduction and murder of Colleen Reed. On April 20th, he went to the Bell County Sheriff's Office to give an official statement. The next day, he was arrested. On May 1st, America's Most Wanted aired a segment on McDuff, and 2 days later, a tip was called in from Kansas City. The caller said a co-worker of his recognized McDuff as a local garbage collector called Richard Fowler. The fingerprints that Kansas City had on file for Fowler were determined to be a match for Kenneth McDuff. Officials set a plan in motion to catch him as he worked his route on the garbage truck the next day. They set up a wait station at 85th and Prospect and waited, knowing that Kenneth's truck would pass through there between 1 and 2 p.m. They approached the truck with guns drawn and immediately recognized McDuff. He was arrested without incident. He maintained to officers that his name was Richard Fowler, and when Officer Robert Harlow handed McDuff a piece of paper with Kenneth McDuff written on it that had been confiscated from him, he finally admitted his real name. Within a few days, McDuff would find himself being escorted back to Texas by U.S. Marshals on an airplane. McDuff was officially indicted and charged with the murder of Melissa Northrup on June 26, 1992. They tried him separately for her murder as they had the strongest evidence for it. Many witnesses were called to the stand, including Addie and many of McDuff's so-called friends. The community was outraged, and McDuff was escorted to court by officers armed with shotguns every day. He eventually took the stand himself, which usually doesn't help someone accused of murder. He wove fantastical tales of what happened that night without a shred of evidence to back them up. Ultimately, McDuff was found guilty after the jury deliberated for 4 hours. During the sentencing portion of the trial, Hank Worley would be called to tell his story, and it took the jury only an hour to return with a death sentence recommendation. McDuff is the only person known to have ever been sentenced to death twice. Though her body had never been found, the prosecutor believed there was enough evidence to go to trial in the case of Colleen Reed. On January 20th, 1994, it began. McDuff was often disruptive and childish during the trial, even being removed from the courtroom once. Hank Worley was the star witness, and he told the court in great detail exactly what happened the night of Colleen's murder. The defense tried to make the case that Hank was actually the murderer instead of Kenneth. It didn't work. He was found guilty and sentenced to death yet again. The McDuff ordeal brought about sweeping changes to the Texas justice system. New prisons were constructed to cut down on overcrowding, and laws were put in place to ensure that men like Kenneth McDuff would spend no less than 40 years in prison, along with changing parole policies. McDuff would go to prison and spend the rest of his days in administrative segregation for his own protection. He was the most hated man in prison and would have likely been murdered in general population. Hank Worley was sentenced to 40 years for aggravated sexual assault and will be eligible for release in 2032 at the ripe old age of 75. Leading up to his execution, a confidential informant was enlisted to see if he could get information from McDuff on the whereabouts of the bodies of Valencia Joshua, Regina Moore, Brenda Thompson, and Colleen Reed. The CI later told them to check a wooded area near TSTI, and sure enough, they uncovered the body of Valencia 2 weeks later. The CI had gained some level of trust from McDuff and was able to get info in casual conversation. According to the CI, McDuff initially resisted, saying if they found the bodies, they, quote, won't need me anymore. Eventually, McDuff told the informant where he killed and buried Gina, and with the information from the informant, investigators were able to locate and exhume Gina's body beneath a bridge on State Highway 6. 2 days later, officials took another tidbit of information from the CI, and after a struggle, Brenda's skeleton was finally recovered. The only information known about Colleen's whereabouts was that she was somewhere east of Interstate 35, not nearly enough information to find a body. McDuff wanted to hold this information as he thought he might lose some of the luxuries of prison, such as commissary. The CI actually managed to convince Kenneth to talk to the Assistant U.S. Attorney, Bill Johnston, who was in the region at the time. Bill promised McDuff that nothing would change if he gave information, and reluctantly, he did just that. He described the area where he buried her body, adding, quote, "You can't find it. I'm going to have to be there with you." A team went to the area and began excavating using graders to gradually remove dirt in fine layers. As time wore on, they were unable to find Colleen, and grudgingly, an arrangement was made to secretly pull McDuff from prison and bring him to the site. At the site, Kenneth noticed that the area wasn't as he remembered it. The Army Corps of Engineers had altered the terrain due to flooding between 1992 and 1998, so the landscape was very different. Eventually, after some time scanning the surroundings, McDuff finally led them to where he buried Colleen's body, and a short time later, they uncovered her skeleton. 9 days later, a federal judge lifted all of the stays of execution and set an execution date of November 17, 1998 for Kenneth McDuff. On that day, Kenneth spoke his last words, quote, "I am ready to be released. Release me." McDuff was executed by lethal injection, undoubtedly a much less torturous death than he put his victims through. And that's it for episode 4. I want to thank you again for listening. There's a lot more information on this case that I didn't cover. If you really want to know more, get the book The Bad Boy from Rosebud by Gary Laverne. I really can't recommend it enough. It's a fascinating book full of crazy stories of McDuff's shenanigans. I'm looking for case suggestions or, well, any other feedback you might have, so shoot me a line on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or worsethanfiction.com. Until next time, goodbye.